In the amazing world of the NBA, some teams have gone beyond everyone's dreams by going really far in the playoffs. Against all odds, these squads embarked on unforgettable playoff journeys. So sit back and relax as we dive into the top 10 worst teams to make it the furthest. Number 10. The 2007 Cleveland Cavaliers. With 50 wins, the Cleveland Cavaliers were second in the East, but to be honest, nobody took them very seriously. In the playoffs, they actually did really well. In the first round, they swept the Wizards and eventually made it to the finals to face the San Antonio Spurs. And unfortunately, they were no match for the Spurs, losing in 4 games. In the regular season, they were of course led by LeBron James, who averaged 27 points per game, 6.7 rebounds, and 6 assists. And let's be honest, the rest of the team was nothing to write home about. With LeBron James, there was Larry Hughes, Drew Gooden, Ilgauskas, Varejao, Eric Snow, and not much else. The fact that they made the finals is incredible, and with that roster, it goes to show you how good LeBron James really was.
Coming over, and Marshall just making himself available.
Number 9, the 2007 Golden State Warriors. Ah yes, this Warriors team is famous for taking down the juggernaut of the Dallas Mavericks. It was a complete shock. Nobody expected that to happen. The Warriors finished 8th in the regular season with a record of 42-40. They were 30th in the league out of 30 for opponent points per game. And yet somehow they took down the Dallas Mavericks, who were one of the favorites to win the championship. It was amazing. Nobody thought this pesky Warriors team would get far at all. The best player on this Warriors team was Baron Davis, who averaged 20 points per game. The team had multiple scorers that averaged over 16 points per game, including Steven Jackson, Jason Richardson, Al Harrington, and Monte Ellis. But still, no one expected them to go this far into the playoffs. Eventually, they did lose to the Utah Jazz in the NBA Western Conference semifinals, but hey, at least they made it past the Dallas Mavericks, which is why they landed at number 9 on our list. Number 8, another LeBron James team, the 2018 Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cleveland Cavaliers were not the team that had Kyrie Irving and LeBron James. This was after Kyrie Irving, and yet they still made it all the way to the NBA Finals. They were 4th in the East when the season finished, and LeBron James was their fearless leader, averaging again 27 points per game, nearly 9 rebounds per game, and 9 assists per game. That team had J.R. Smith, Kevin Love, George Hill, Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, and Rodney Hood. Nobody expected this team to make it very far, and yet they did. How? I remember watching that year and thinking, how is this team making it that far? Well, the answer was simple. It's LeBron James. In 7 games, they beat the Pacers in the first round of the playoffs. Then they swept the Toronto Raptors, the baby dinosaurs. Then they had another 7-game series against the Celtics where they narrowly defeated Jason Tatum and the Boston Celtics. And then, unfortunately, their Cinderella dance would come to an end as they would get swept by the Golden State Warriors. Still, they made it further than anyone thought, and that's why they fall at number 8 on the list.
And as he gets the layup.
Number 7, the 1994 Denver Nuggets. The 1994 Denver Nuggets finished the season with a record of 42-40. They were another example of an 8th seed that took down the number 1 seed, just as the 2007 Golden State Warriors did. But this time, in the Western Conference semifinals, things went a little bit different. Interestingly, they also faced the Utah Jazz after beating the first seed Seattle Supersonics. And they did lose just as the 2007 Golden State Warriors did, but they took the Utah Jazz to 7 games. The most interesting thing to note about that experience is that they were actually down 3-1 before rallying and almost being the first team to come back from a 3-1 deficit. Their team was not very flashy. Their best players were Abdul Rauf and Dikembe Mutombo on the defensive end. Nobody considered them a serious contender. The preseason odds for a championship for this team were a plus 10,000 with an over-under of 39.5. And yet, they shocked the world by defeating the Seattle Supersonics in the first round of the playoffs, which is why they deserved the 7th spot on our list.
The ball and hurries the Sonics.
Number 6, the 2021 Atlanta Hawks. Yes, this team wasn't the greatest. They won 41 games and lost 31, finishing 5th in the NBA Eastern Conference. But no one could have predicted what they did in the playoffs. In the first round, they beat the New York Knicks 4-1. In the second round, in the Eastern Conference semifinals, this team took Joel Embiid and the Philadelphia 76ers to 7 games and beat them in 7 games. And then finally, their dance would come to an end as they would lose to the Milwaukee Bucks in 6 games. But still, this journey was incredible. Trae Young, who averaged 25.3 points per game during the regular season, was their main player during the playoffs and the only player that averaged over 20 points per game in their playoff run. But this team had Bogdan Bogdanovic, John Collins, Clint Capella, and others. Still, this was one of the more surprising playoff runs in playoff history. Number 5, the 2002 New Jersey Nets. The New Jersey Nets were the top of the East, but the Eastern Conference was terrible. They only had 52 wins, and no one averaged over 15 points per game. Let me repeat that. No one on this team during the regular season averaged over 15 points per game. They were 13th in the league in points per game, and 5th in the league in opponents' points per game. This team was led by Jason Kidd, who was a really good player. He averaged 14.7 points per game, 9.9 assists, and 7.3 rebounds. They made it all the way to the NBA Finals. How? Well, in the first round, they beat the Indiana Pacers in 5 games. Then they beat the Charlotte Hornets in 5 games. Then, in the NBA Eastern Conference Finals, they beat the Boston Celtics in 6 games. And then they got to the finals and got swept by the Los Angeles Lakers. It's crazy that they made it this far, and the reason they did was because the East was so terrible that year. It's not surprising at all that they got swept in the finals, and that's why they made our list at number 5. Number 4, the 1981 Houston Rockets. This team had a losing record, if you believe it. They only won 40 games and lost 42 games, and somehow they made it all the way to the NBA Finals. The best player on their team by far was Moses Malone. He was an animal. He was a beast out there, grabbing 14.8 rebounds during the regular season and averaging 27.8 points per game. Somehow he was able to carry his team all the way into the finals. And surprisingly, they did not even get swept when they got there. As the 6th seed, they made it to the finals by beating the Los Angeles Lakers, the San Antonio Spurs, the Kansas City Kings, and then they lost in 6 games to the Boston Celtics, a much more competitive series than many would have thought. In fact, this team by far outperformed any of the expectations that anyone would have had for them, and that's why they sit at number 4. Number 3, the 2020 Miami Heat. Yes, this was the COVID year, and maybe that's the reason they made it a lot further into the playoffs than many originally thought possible. Jimmy Butler was their main player during the regular season, but nobody on their team averaged over 20 points per game. Nobody. And yet, this team made it into the NBA Finals. In the COVID bubble, they swept the Indiana Pacers. They beat the Milwaukee Bucks with Giannis Antetokounmpo 4-1. Then they beat the Boston Celtics 4-2. And then finally, they lost to the Los Angeles Lakers 2-4. But this was an incredible run. The preseason odds for this team winning the championship was plus 6,000 with an over-under of 43.5. And yet, they made the finals and lost in 6 games. Still, one of the most memorable and incredible runs in NBA history by a team that nobody thought would make it that far.
5-second difference, shot clock and game clock.
Number 2, the 1999 New York Knicks. This is the first 8th seed, as far as I'm aware, to make the NBA Finals. They were coached by the legend Jeff Van Gundy, and the best player on their team was Patrick Ewing. But they actually had a pretty nice roster with Allen Houston, Patrick Ewing, Larry Johnson, and Latrell Sprewell. Patrick Ewing was averaging 9.9 rebounds and 17.3 points per game. They beat the Miami Heat in 5 games in the first round, then they swept the Atlanta Hawks 4-0. They beat the Indiana Pacers 4-2, and finally in the NBA Finals they lost to the San Antonio Spurs in 5 games. It's crazy that this team as an 8th seed would make it all the way to the finals. It was a shortened NBA season, so things were a little strange, but still they fall in at number 2. Number 1, you already know what it is, the 2023 Miami Heat. They are easily the worst team to make it the furthest, and that's no knock on them. They exceeded expectations at every turn. They had 3 players averaging over 20 points per game, Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, and Tyler Hero. But the reason they fit at number 1, the reason they are the most unexpected team to make it the furthest, is because they not only were the 8th seeds going into the playoffs, but in order to make the playoffs, they had to play not 1, but 2 play-in games. They lost the first play-in game to the Hawks, and then they won the next one to clinch the 8th seed in the NBA Eastern Conference playoffs. And then somehow they made it past the Milwaukee Bucks with Giannis Antetokounmpo. They made it past the New York Knicks 4-2. They beat the Boston Celtics in 7 games in a crazy series. And then they went up against the juggernaut Denver Nuggets, losing in only 5 games. But still, many thought they wouldn't even win a game against the Nuggets. Many thought they wouldn't even make the playoffs or even make it past the first round or the play-in. And yet, this Cinderella story lives on in NBA history. This Miami Heat team is considered the worst team to make it the furthest, not because they were a bad team, but because they had such a tough journey that they endured to make it to the finals. For sure, this Miami Heat team will be looked back on. I want to be clear, all of the teams that we looked at aren't necessarily terrible teams, but they are very surprising. They are teams that outdid expectations at every turn. Their performance in the regular season did not reflect how well they did in the NBA playoffs. And that's the reason why we consider them the worst teams to make it the furthest, meaning the worst teams in the regular season that made it the furthest during the playoffs. What do you think? Are there any teams we left off of this list? Are we completely wrong in some of the teams that we included? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. This is NBA Informatics, the fusion of technology and NBA basketball.